want to take a talk that was originally intended for RICO 2020 in Portland and really thrust it into the reality that we're all living today. That reality that exists under the coronavirus pandemic. Because we're really all together in this incredibly altered world. And we're all affected by what that means to each of our roles in coffee, to the industry overall, and to the communities in which that industry operates. So what I really want to do today is build an awareness of that concept of community, where it starts, how far it extends, and how it creates an opportunity like we've never had before to stave off concerns of future price crises, to delink from the C price, and to focus on building an industry that thrives, not on the backs of workers and smallholder farmers, but because there's a stability brought on by a community where everyone is afforded basic decency. And those of you that have heard me speak before will know that what you're really going to walk away with today is a sense of what steps you need to take to ensure living wages or incomes for your workers and for everyone in your supply chains, as well as why you should take those steps really starting today. So why is community important to achieving a living wage or a living income? Because making sure everyone involved in making the cup of delicious specialty coffee I drink earns enough to live with a basic standard of decency is likely not something that any of us can do on our own. That's a hard reality. It's something that everyone listening to this talk has to work together towards. It's something that everyone here, I'm sure, and every coffee drinker around the world has been reconnecting with right now. That sense of community. It's just that what we have now is an opportunity to build back better by tapping into that shared sense of the importance of community that extends throughout the value chain and to consumers to really create a more sustainable industry. I want to show how in this context, there's a better chance to ensure living wages and living incomes. So for me, I live in Tarrytown, New York, and in my community, I frequent Coffee Labs. It's my local roaster. I love their coffee. And I love that they build transparent relationships with the farmers that grow that coffee that extend to me as a consumer. It's where I used to head when I had meetings or wanted to chat with a friend when I could do in person. And it's now where I go to buy the coffee I brew at home or to check out local music that they stream online during this pandemic when I can't sit and have a cup of coffee with my community. For me, Coffee Labs is a part of my community, and the concept of that community has become really concrete at a time when so many of us have been locked away. So I'm first going to pose a question and ask you all to think about what you consider to be your communities. Think about that community that when money is tight, as it is for many of us right now, times are stressful and the future is uncertain, you worry about when you go to bed at night. Now, I'm going to think that many of you started that community with your families and really thinking about how you can pay your bills and stay afloat. And then you move on from your families to your workers. And you think about, well, what do my workers need in order to continue to maintain through this time? So what you'll see up is Coffee Labs and their dogs, which represents their families, and then a picture of barista in the top that works at Coffee Labs that really signifies the community of your particular business. Then I want to highlight the community in which you live, the first responders and neighbors that are likely suffering right now and for whom you've probably been doing small things to help them out, sending coffee to them, thinking about them, trying to help them with grocery shopping, right? And I'm going to hop next to the farmers that are growing your coffee. Since this, from my perspective, is of my neighborhood roaster, but really producers can just flip everything around since you have your own families and workers and communities to think about. But ultimately what I'm trying to get at here is that producers and buyers are totally dependent on one another for success. And so I'm asking farmers to see roasters and buyers as their community as much as I'm asking roasters and buyers to pull their farmers closer as theirs. And then I'm asking us to see how we are one community within the SCA that can have some level of pre-competitive collaboration to really build back better in a way that is beneficial to workers, to businesses, and to our communities. Okay, so now how do we do that? Well, I want to start with all of us thinking about living wage or living income as a benchmark for all of our decisions about how we buy and sell coffee. There are several reasons, but essentially ensuring enough money at each level of the value chain to secure a basic but decent living that affords some margin for savings to weather unexpected events like our current pandemic is really essential to having a healthy community in every last iteration that we just went through. I'm going to take a step back now, and I'm going to ensure that we're all on the same page in terms of what a living wage and what a living income actually are. I have here two definitions. One is from the Global Living Wage Coalition on living wages, and one is from the Living Income Community of Practice on living incomes. Both of these organizations have worked to create benchmarks in order to guide this work. And if you'll remember, I mentioned earlier that I'm posing a solution to delinking from the C price and avoiding future price crises in coffee. That's because looking at pricing from the standpoint of ensuring adequate pay for everyone in the coffee value chain, the largest cost of sustainable production, creates a new way to establish prices where increases can be expected and pegged against inflation levels, rather than widely variable based upon the markets. So first, let's establish the living wage and living income, as defined here, are really measuring what's necessary for a lifestyle that's basic but decent, not one that's exorbitant and expects you to have expensive cars and, high-priced homes. What you see here is a picture of a woman. She's in a kitchen that qualifies as decent where she lives in Guatemala. It's not fancy, but it meets a standard that's safe and healthy and consistent with local conditions. This is what is meant in a living wage or income estimate by Decent Housing. The picture at the bottom of the slide is a food market in Malawi and shows how food prices for a living wage or an income are established really by visiting the places that people shop to get the most affordable possible diet that meets nutritional needs in terms of macro and micronutrients and caloric intake. Both of these photos are from the Global Living Wage Coalition, where the gold standard of estimating living wages and incomes around the world, the Anchor methodology, was established by husband and wife team Richard and Martha Anchor. I want to draw your attention to the picture at the center and tell you why it's really here. I wanted to illustrate that living wages and incomes are a family concept. And I think that this is really important to illustrate for farm workers and others, but especially pertinent for one group that often gets left out in living wage discussions: baristas. Baristas very rarely earn a living wage that will allow them to build a family, and often they don't even earn enough to sustain a decent livelihood for themselves. So for those of you here who really want to keep your baristas and allow them to grow in the career and want to be able to have a little savings for them to help them through times like we're experiencing now, you have to think from the two most vulnerable points of the supply chain when you're talking about living wages: the beginning and the end, the farm workers and the baristas. And to that end, that's the whole of your community that you can be using this time to map. And I want to show you exactly how you can map that community, assess how you're contributing to a living wage or income throughout that community, and work with everyone else in your supply chains as well as the SCA to create an environment where we can all build back a more sustainable industry. Again, because we can't really do this alone. And I'd like to go back to that concept of community to tell you why I think now, even while everyone is struggling, is the perfect opportunity, the best we've ever had, to build business in this new sustainable model. If you recall earlier, I mentioned that I see Coffee Labs, my roaster, as a part of my personal community. I work on living wages and incomes globally and across industries. So I see them as such, not because I'm embedded in the coffee industry, but because I'm like the billions of other coffee consumers out there in the world who've become even more aware and connected to the businesses and people in my community. And that leads me to the all-important piece of our community that will make living wages and incomes possible: consumers. I want to reference here a few key points of research that show how consumers have evolved since this pandemic hit. First, consumers don't expect prices for anything they buy to stay the same and have no idea what changes to expect. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics Consumer Price Index, U.S. consumers are paying more across the board for non-alcoholic beverages since February 2020, when the coronavirus pandemic really hit in the U.S. Consumers in other countries are seeing similar price increases. But the price of roasted coffee in the US actually dropped in May 2020. So why are we as a community not looking at the fact that one of the biggest barriers to ensuring a living wage and living income for everyone is usually that consumers are concerned about price changes? And right now that's been blown away and there are no price expectations. So we exist in an environment where consumers have lost their price expectations and are resetting the ways in which they spend their money. And of the things that they feel are more essential than others, visiting coffee shops and cafes to be together with their communities is a top priority. Once life finds its new normal, they'll be back. And in the UK, an Allegra survey of consumers that asked which social activities were missed most ranked visiting coffee shops and cafes as number 2 among 17 proposed social activities. So we have a situation where we can see that people aren't stopping drinking coffee. They haven't when the world is frozen, and they're ready to do so socially as soon as possible. So we can see that people don't want to stop drinking coffee. They haven't really stopped drinking coffee, even as the world is frozen. I have no idea when we'll be presented with a more ideal scenario to reset the way the coffee community works, to ensure that living wages and incomes are priced into every cup. I want to bolster that point a little more by showing that even while we are in a financially tight situation around the world, the increase in average ticket price from consumers at their local coffee shops has increased by nearly 25%. If you needed more evidence that coffee is a priority, I don't really know where you're going to get it. People will not go without a cup and are turning to local coffee shops to buy brewing equipment as well as large orders for everyone in their homes instead of just snagging a cup of coffee on their way to work. Spending on coffee is still a priority for consumers. And there's another thing I want to highlight that goes back to why I'm couching this entire discussion in a sense of community. Consumers are also more attached to their communities than ever before and are looking for ways to support workers that they depend on. They're ready to increase their own awareness of how they can help support others in their community and really globally, honestly. You can see that in the massive increases to healthcare sales of coffee since shelter in place took place, right? Everyone is saying, I want to go out and make sure coffee can be delivered to my local hospital and to the people that are helping me. And that aligns with a survey by Just Capital from 2018 that looked at all demographics across the US and found out that the #1 issue for sustainability for them was living wages. Now we're in a post-COVID era when people have seen that even deeper, that it's important to pay a living wage. And that's a reason to think about baristas as the front line of communication to consumers and ensure that they're earning a living wage. And then think about how they can communicate the importance of that to consumers and that the price of coffee may need to increase a bit because the business that the barista works for wants to take care of them, as well as the farm workers and everyone else that deserves the respect of a decent wage in producing a cup of coffee. I mentioned before that I work on these issues in a range of industries, right? And I want to use one of those experiences here to really drive home this point of how having workers that are communicating directly with consumers about being paid a living wage and are really equipped to understand and talk about the need for a living wage is not only beneficial to workers, but also to the business itself and highly desired in their communities. I worked with a fast casual food chain of restaurants with about 600 employees. And the owner was really dedicated to living wages. And despite being in an industry and in areas where prevailing wages and minimum wages were incredibly low, he decided to move his entire staff to a living wage. And he expected huge hit profits and froze all salaries of upper management to try and absorb it. But surprisingly, the inverse happens. Profits actually increased because revenues went through the roof. Because the community of consumers heard from servers when they talked about how their employer was trying to get them a living wage. And as word spread, more people wanted to support that effort and that business. Now that was pre-COVID. Today, this sense of community is even stronger. And for all of you listening that employ customer-facing workers, think to yourself whether you can start your journey by simply asking your customers whether they'd be supportive in an increase to their price of their cup of coffee or bag of roasted beans to ensure that every worker, the ones they know and the ones they don't, are paid a living wage. And think about how you can more closely tie together that community in your consumers' minds. You can share the names and stories of your producers throughout the supply chain with your customers, or have a day when they visit and customers talk about how they grow their coffee with them. Help consumers to see all the people that work hard to produce and prepare their cup of coffee. Okay, so now I want to step into action. What are the things that you can do to make this talk about building community and contributing your part to ensuring a living wage or income to make that community stable, sustainable, and thriving? 1, map your supply chain. Think about everyone you have a relationship with from wherever you sit in the coffee world, and work to build those relationships in a way that creates long-term understanding and commitment so that you can really talk about your responsibility to provide a living wage and income and the conditions that exist currently that might get in the way of that. You'll have to solve these problems together. 2, start assessing the costs that exist today for the work you do and learn about what would change if you ensured a living wage for every worker, every hour that went into producing that coffee. That means that if you run a coffee shop or cafe and you're not roasting for yourself, you need to know your costs, what the living wage rates are in your area, and the number of working hours that goes into that cup of coffee. You need the same information for your roaster, the same information for your farmer, and really anybody that's involved at all in producing that cup of coffee. That's the assessment. 3, here's the change. And this is where you can do something on your own, but also benefit from working together as an industry. Identify the levers to raising wages and incomes: price, productivity, access to finance, to weather unexpected issues, and so on. There are a wealth of contributing factors to covering decent incomes, and even more tools to help you understand how to do that assessment. And what you're looking for here is the gap that needs to be covered to ensure everyone in specialty coffee can live at a basic level of decency. Then you can really look at what percentage of that change can be covered by each of the levers you identified. This is of supreme importance because the solution will require hitting the issue from multiple angles. But once you've covered these sustainable costs of production, you can have a more stable expectation on coffee pricing in the future. You can plan for inflation bumps rather than responding to the wild fluctuations of the market. All right, so let's unpack this a little bit with an example. I'm using the illustrative look laid out in the SCA's Economics of the Coffee Supply Chain. These include green bean prices, roaster sales prices, and retail yield per pound. Assuming 15 cups, $2.80 per cup per pound, it's just going against a published case that you'll see to the right about a coffee farmer in Colombia. I use this one because it provided information on the current pay for each hour of labor that goes into production, as well as the number of hours that are necessary to produce a pound of green beans of coffee within each labor category, right? And obviously this is a broad general example, so figures will be very different for you when you do your actual assessment in your own supply chains. But it helps us to get a look at how to assess and plan for what needs to happen to get to a supply chain that treats all workers with dignity. And what can be seen as the cost of production per pound for the green beans on this farm, even before adding in living wage and any profit. It's well above the illustrative example provided by the SCA. I've adjusted those figures to account for what an actual living wage might be for every hour contributed to the production of that coffee using the well-accepted living wage studies produced by the Global Living Wage Coalition. And those are already used in coffee supply chains through projects with organizations like IDH, this Dutch Sustainable Trade Initiative, the Global Coffee Platform, and many others. Now, when looking at the margin of profit for a roaster, it becomes even more obvious that a roaster can't just pay a higher price without themselves getting a higher price for roasted coffee to ensure that the sustainable cost of production is covered. And they too might need to make adjustments to a living wage for where they're located to get all workers up to that basic level of decency. And then we look at the profit margins and say, hey, retail coffee can't really cover all these costs either, and likely also needs to raise wages for baristas and others, as I've previously stated. So baristas around the world are not earning a living wage. Something has to really give, and everyone has a role to play in finding a way together to cover the gaps between current wages and living wages. This is one reason why pre-competitive collaboration is so essential to success. The other is simply to help every one of you to actually complete this type of assessment correctly and evaluate where you and your supply chain stands against a living wage. There's a wealth of research on living wage rates around the world. Some are better than others, and really by forming a working group within the SCA, you can get guidance on credible research that has already been accepted in the coffee industry among a range of stakeholders. You can find out what living wage or living income rates you can use to measure the gap you would like to plan to close to get to a more sustainable industry. And you can collaborate on getting research gaps covered rather than having everyone invest on their own in trying to assess the problem. And then as a group, you can work to figure out the levers that are most important to pull to benefit more workers in coffee around the world, ensure your business doesn't suffer by adjusting to this new model, and very importantly right now, to understand how to bolster that effort by engaging that community of consumers that really cares about this issue more than ever. So to that end, I'm sharing the contact information for Kimilena Ionescu, someone you probably all know and who has offered to generously lead such an interested group within the SCA. I can share with Kim a lot of those resources I mentioned, such as the Guiding Steps Towards a Living Income and Supply Chains Toolkit that was just published by GIZ and the Living Income Community of Practice. And I can provide guidance about the wealth of living wage and income benchmarks available globally as work on this issue continues to grow in momentum across a range of sectors and industries. All it really takes to get started on an incredibly valuable journey and take advantage of the opportunity we have now to just build back better is an email to Kim to say, yes, I want my family, I want my workers, my community, my business partners, and my industry to be driven by the concept of shared value that treats workers with respect and ensures long-term sustainability. It's just about taking that first step and following the lead of other industries like banana that created similar groups through the World Banana Forum that has led to major actions with support from all stakeholders in the supply chain, including a Dutch covenant signed by retailers in the Netherlands that promises to ensure a living wage for every banana worker throughout the entirety of the supply chain. The goal's not too lofty. It's totally achievable, but we have to work together and really define our community and our greater community and show we care to achieve it. But I have hope that the disaster of this pandemic can lead to better outcomes for all of us around the world because it shined a light on some of our most pressing problems. I hope that you will consider being a part of that solution and really a new and stronger reality. Thank you very much.